tarde, buenos dias. We wanted to thank you so much for being here with us. As you know, this is a very special occasion that we are providing to our main partners across Latin America. We're glad to have you all here today. This is a very unique webinar hosted by Mr. Pavel. Mr. Pavel has been a great friend of us in Russia. He was one of the key people involved with the negotiations in the end of the Cold War. He worked closely with Gorbachev in the negotiations to end the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. Today, he will be granting us with some of his knowledge and his experiences on what was the Cold War, how did it end, the consequences and the outcomes of it. The idea of us, in this whole big family of ANK Europe that we have, is starting to bring to you some of the access and experiences that we can offer, which are very unique. At the same time, we bring some good news on Russia that we are hoping to have borders open by September, so we can have all of you guys joining us in Europe again. Mr. Pavel will be talking to you for around 40 minutes. We will open for questions and answers, and I ask you to please send me the questions that you might have you have on the right hand corner. You have a place where you can send me your questions. Great. We can see Mr. Pavel now, and he will be talking to us about all the experience he had, and he's going to share that with us. So guys, please feel free to send me the questions you have. You have the little question box panel on the right hand corner. Please send to me. In the end of the presentation, we are going to have 15 minutes of Q&A for Mr. Pavel. Thank you so much, Mr. Pavel. I leave you with our very good friends from Latin America. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. This is not the first time that I'm talking to tourists and tour organizers. Actually, I've been giving these talks in Moscow and also during the cruises for quite a few years. And among the subjects that I talk about is the Cold War and the lessons that we learned from the Cold War, or perhaps have not learned from the Cold War. It's also about how leaders, including Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, ended the Cold War. So those talks normally last for 45, 50 minutes. I will have to compress both themes, both subjects, the Cold War and how the Cold War ended, into 40, 45 minutes. This will not be easy, but I will try so that we still have 15 minutes for Q&A. So the main questions about the Cold War are on this first slide. When did the Cold War start? Was it inevitable? What was it about? So I'll try to cover these questions and also the questions of when the Cold War ended. How did it end? And are we today in a new Cold War? Obviously, this last question is a difficult one, so let us first talk about how the Cold War started, the protagonists of the Cold War. Paradoxically, the protagonists of the Cold War were the people who were allies during World War II, during the war against Nazism. And Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin worked together to defeat Hitler, but they were not able. And also President Truman of the United States were not able to prevent the post-war situation from degenerating into a Cold War. The bomb, the nuclear bomb, played a very important role in the Cold War and in the fact that the Cold War began. Perhaps it could have been a different story had the nuclear bomb, not been developed. Also, my own view is that perhaps had President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States not died in 1945, we would have had a different story. Certainly, Stalin, by his policy of communizing Eastern Europe, of imposing a communist system on Eastern European nations, contributed significantly and perhaps decisively to the Cold War, contributed significantly to the confrontation between the East and the West. However, perhaps the West too could have taken a different path and tried a less confrontational response to Stalin's attempt to impose communism on Eastern European nations. This is for historians to decide. But certainly the West, having a monopoly on nuclear weapons between 1946 and 1949, also took a rather confrontational attitude toward the Soviet Union. So the attempts to end the Cold War started in the 50s after Stalin's death. Could Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader who succeeded Stalin, and Dwight Eisenhower, the American president, a general who fought in World War II and was one of the major actors in defeating Nazism, could they have ended it? Was that a possibility? This is a question that is often asked. My answer is they tried. They tried. They made an honest effort. However, it turned out to be very difficult. One of the reasons for it was that the two nations did not have the diplomatic experience, the experience of previous mistakes from which they could have learned. And so the various incidents, the various things that are inevitable in relations between great powers, their disagreements that are inevitable even when the nations are not divided by different ideologies. Those disagreements took on an oversized scale, an oversized aspect. For example, one can say that the attempt by Eisenhower and Khrushchev to end the Cold War and to start on a more cooperative path ended, went down in flames when an American spy plane, U-2, was shot down over the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. The United States wanted information about Soviet arsenals of nuclear weapons. By that time, the Soviet Union too had nuclear weapons. It had missiles, it had bombers with nuclear weapons. So the United States wanted information about it. And so it sent spy planes that it thought were invulnerable to Soviet rockets or to Soviet fighter planes who could have shot it down. But on this one occasion, the spy plane, the U-2, was shot down by a Soviet rocket, and the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, ejected from that plane and was then captured by the Soviet military on the ground. And this incident, which of course was a lot of unpleasantness, which of course was a difficult episode, as I said, took on an oversized scale because Nikita Khrushchev said, well, if you are spying over our territory, then I cancel the summit with President Eisenhower. So, on the one hand, the United States should not have done what it did, spying over the sovereign territory of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, obviously, Nikita Khrushchev overreacted. But then they tried again. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev met with the young American president, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was young. John F. Kennedy wanted peace. Khrushchev too wanted peace. Perhaps they both wanted to end the Cold War. But their summit meeting was not well prepared. They basically played it by ear. They did not succeed in establishing a political and a personal rapport, which is absolutely necessary for two leaders to build trust and to engage in some kind of a cooperation, in a negotiation. So that is an interesting example of two basically well-intentioned leaders who were not able to engage because of the poor preparation for their summit. It didn't work. And because it didn't work, the Cold War not just resumed, but it increased in intensity, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which fortunately, because in the final moment both Khrushchev and Kennedy displayed wisdom, that crisis did not end in a war, did not end in a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. But basically, one can say that that generation of leaders did not succeed in ending the Cold War. But then their successors, Brezhnev and Nixon, tried again. This is a photo of the summit meeting between Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon. And in addition to trying to improve relations between the Soviet Union and the United States, they also tried to end the arms race. The arms race was the inevitable consequence of the Cold War. The threat from the other side was often exaggerated, it is often overstated. And the result is that the other side not just responds, but runs ahead of that country which it sees as a threat. So, Brezhnev and Nixon tried to end that spiral of the arms race. They tried to put a cap on the numbers of nuclear weapons, in particular strategic nuclear weapons. And also, they tried to constrain the missile defense systems that both sides were developing. So, once again, those two men did make an honest effort to end the Cold War, but they too did not really succeed, even though they concluded the first nuclear arms limitation agreement, which was called the ABM Treaty, the Anti Ballistic Missile Treaty. Here you have the photo of Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signing the ABM Treaty. ABM is missile defense, but missile defenses contribute to a race in offensive arms. So instead of an unlimited deployment of missile defenses, they decided to significantly limit the number of defensive systems that both sides could deploy. And that was a great achievement. So they did a good job. Even though they did not really end the Cold War, they at least ended a race in anti ballistic missile systems. And what emerged as a result also of an agreement to limit the number of nuclear missiles and bombers was called détente. That's a French word that basically means the easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. So here you see Leonid Brezhnev and the American president who succeeded Richard Nixon when he had to resign, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev met in the easternmost city of the Soviet Union, Vladivostok, and they discussed further limitations on nuclear arms, nuclear weapons, to limit not only the number of missiles and bombers, but also to limit the number of warheads, of nuclear warheads that they can carry. That was a big challenge because no one knows, no one knew at that time how to verify the number of warheads per each missile or bomber. So they had to address this. And unfortunately, they did not succeed. So the result was that even though the number of missiles and the number of bombers were capped, were uh, limited to a certain seeding, the number of warheads that could be installed on each missile and bomber was not limited in any way, and the arms race, the nuclear arms race, unfortunately resumed. Then comes the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is a treaty that Leonid Brezhnev signed with Jimmy Carter, the third American president with whom he dealt. And it was a good treaty. It was a treaty that, at least to some extent, also limited the number of warheads. It did not limit them enough, unfortunately. The buildup of nuclear weapons continued throughout the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s, but nevertheless, the SALT Treaty was an attempt, at least an attempt, and uh, in part a successful attempt to limit the number of nuclear warheads. But then détente, the easing of tensions, collapsed. It collapsed primarily because of the invasion of the Soviet Union into Afghanistan and the American reaction to that invasion. Afghanistan is not a place, in my view, that is so strategically important that you have to basically ruin the whole relationship between the great powers, the US and the Soviet Union, because of Afghanistan. It was a mistake to move into Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, but it was also a mistake by the United States to overreact to that unfortunate development. And so the United States announced that it will not ratify the SALT Treaty, the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Nuclear Weapons. Détente collapsed, the relationship was frozen, and that continued for at least 6 years. For 6 years between 1979 and 1985, the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States did not meet. There were no summits, there were no new agreements, and the old agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States were in jeopardy. This was a dangerous period for the US, for the Soviet Union, but also for the world. The two sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, were deploying nuclear missiles of intermediate range also in Europe, not just in the United States and the Soviet Union, not just in silos and on submarines, but also mobile nuclear missiles in Europe that could reach the territories of the Soviet Union and the European countries. This was a moment of great tension in relations between the Soviet Union and the West. I was working at that time in the Soviet Foreign Ministry. I participated in various negotiations and talks to try to end that particularly dangerous situation, but unfortunately, those talks, those negotiations did not succeed. Now, this is the cover of the book by the former ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock. It is about how the Cold War ended, Reagan and Gorbachev, how the Cold War ended. I recommend that book for those of you who are interested, but I also would like to, frankly, recommend my book and to talk a little bit about myself and about my participation in ending the Cold War, and specifically in the talks between Leonid Brezhnev, between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. This is an interesting picture. It's in French, and the question in French that is shown here is who makes it possible for important people to understand each other. So this is a picture where it is shown who did it. It's a picture of Reagan, Gorbachev, and myself. I am honored to have participated in that process, and I'm honored to have worked with those leaders. Uh, my, I will share some of my recollections about the meetings that ended the Cold War. This is a picture of the first talk between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in Geneva in November 1985. Their meeting was by no means a love fest. It was not an easy meeting because there was so much mistrust and misunderstanding that had accumulated during the 6 years when there was no high level contact between the leaders of those two nations. Nevertheless, those leaders were able to agree on a joint statement that said a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And they also emphasized the importance of preventing any war between them, whether nuclear or conventional. They also pledged not to seek to achieve military superiority. That agreement in principle was of enormous importance because it kind of changed the tune for the two nations, for their militaries, for their diplomats. It was a call to them to engage, to negotiate, and to end the nuclear arms race that had by that time produced over 50,000 nuclear warheads in the arsenals of those two nations. The next meeting was in Reykjavik, in October 1985, where they discussed the specifics of arms control agreements. And very often the question is asked whether Reykjavik was a failure or a breakthrough. Initially, our American colleagues called Reykjavik a failure because the two presidents discussed the parameters of nuclear arms agreements, and they agreed on most of those parameters regarding strategic weapons, intermediate range weapons, and they discussed their common desire to ultimately eliminate, abolish all nuclear weapons. You know that President Reagan had that dream about a kind of Star Wars system that would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete because he hated nuclear weapons. The Star Wars system, the system of total missile defense, turned out to be a pipe dream. But it also reflected President Reagan's hatred of nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev shared that hatred. So when the meeting in Reykjavik ended, he announced that even though agreements were not reached because President Reagan insisted on Gorbachev's approving the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars system, and Gorbachev could not do that. But even though they disagreed on that one point, Gorbachev said this was an important meeting. It was actually not a failure, but a breakthrough, because he said we agreed on so many other things, and we hope to conclude agreements on reducing the arsenals of nuclear weapons, and because also we both share the dream of a world without nuclear weapons. So Time magazine said no deal, but Gorbachev and then Reagan agreed that this was an extremely important summit. The arms talks continued. George Shultz, the Secretary of State of the United States, came to Moscow, and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Edward Shevardnadze, went to Washington several times in order to hammer out the specifics of the first arms reduction agreement. That was the agreement on eliminating and destroying the missiles of intermediate range, INF missiles. So in December 1987, that first agreement that actually eliminated two categories of nuclear weapons, land-based intermediate and land-based shorter range missiles, the agreement that for the first time was a real arms reduction agreement rather than just an arms limitation agreement, was signed in Washington in December 1987. An extremely important step forward in reducing the arsenals of those two nations. Even today, those arsenals are enormous, and the Soviet Union, Russia as a successor to the Soviet Union, and the United States still have over 90% of the overall arsenals of nuclear weapons. That is to say, all the other nuclear powers, including China, Great Britain, France, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, taken together, have less than 1/10 of the number of warheads in the arsenals of Russia and the United States. So we still have enormous numbers of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy civilization. But 85% of the arsenals held by the United States and the Soviet Union at the peak of the Cold War have by now been destroyed. They've been all decommissioned. Most of them have been destroyed or are in the process of being destroyed. And so December 1987 is when this process started, and we hope that it will continue. So these are some pictures of that first successful summit, of the summit that began to end the nuclear arms race and the Cold War. The atmosphere is very different. Trust is emerging between the leaders, but much work, of course, remains to be done. This is the departure ceremony at the White House after the signing of the first arms reduction agreement. As you can see, it's a rainy day, but it was a great day. President Reagan came to Moscow in the summer of 1988. This is perhaps the most memorable picture from that summit. Reagan and Gorbachev took a walk on a Red Square. And during that walk, they talked very warmly to Soviet citizens. And then, after they passed the Red Square, they returned to the Kremlin. And I remember the moment very vividly when, after they returned to the Kremlin, they stopped by a group of reporters, American and Soviet reporters, who asked them questions. And one of the reporters asked President Reagan this question: Mr. President, do you still regard the Soviet Union as an evil empire? You know that Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. That was in the early 1980s when she had just become the president of the United States. And so he was, I think, very candid, very frank when he said that. But on this occasion, when she was asked whether he still regarded the Soviet Union as an evil empire, he was equally candid. And he very simply said no. No, that was a different time, a different era. Now the Soviet Union, under the leadership of President Gorbachev, is changing, and we expect that we will continue to work together to end the nuclear arms race and to ultimately abolish nuclear weapons. So that was perhaps the moment of the beginning of the end of the Cold War. That's, in my opinion, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Moscow, July 1988, when President Reagan recognized that he no longer regarded the Soviet Union as an evil empire. So this is again President Reagan and President Gorbachev against the background of St. Basil's Cathedral, one of the most beautiful sights of Moscow. It's right on Red Square. They're posing for photographers, and basically they, in this way, recognize that the two nations were no longer enemies. They no longer regard each other as evil. Now, the next US president with whom President Gorbachev dealt is George Bush, the first President Bush, as we call him. President Bush basically continued the policy of President Reagan. He too worked with Gorbachev to reach an agreement on limiting and reducing the numbers of strategic nuclear weapons. So those weapons that can reach the territory of the other side from their own territory. That was an extremely difficult process. The START Treaty, the first START Treaty that was signed by Gorbachev and Bush, consists of hundreds of pages of the treaty text and the various protocols and statements attached to that treaty. So it was enormous work that needed to be done. It took, I would say, too much time, but ultimately it succeeded. So we can say that those three persons, Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, worked together, and the three of them deserve credit for ending the Cold War and ending the arms race. So this historic photo of the three leaders against the backdrop of the Statue of Liberty in New York, it's truly historic, and I think it symbolizes the cooperation of those three men in ending the Cold War. Uh, the official end of the Cold War perhaps was at Malta in December 1989, when President Gorbachev said to President Bush that we are ready not to regard the United States as an enemy, that we want to be partners. And they shook hands on that statement. The two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States, stood together during the crises that followed that momentous announcement of the end of the Cold War. In particular, they cooperated in reversing the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. A very important moment. This is when Secretary of State Baker and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze learned of the fact that Iraq had occupied Kuwait, and they immediately agreed that they would work together. In Helsinki in September 1990, Gorbachev and Bush reaffirmed the end of the confrontation and reaffirmed that they will work to reverse Iraqi aggression against Kuwait. Finally, in Moscow in July 1991, Bush signed the START Treaty, reducing the number of strategic nuclear warheads and missiles by 50%, cutting in half those enormous arsenals. Another great achievement. So where Reagan was 3 years before, here are Gorbachev and Bush repeating the same walk in Red Square and reinforcing, I think, the impression that those two nations were no longer enemies. The summit in Moscow was very informal, very productive. You can see here the two presidents very much at ease with each other. They discussed the possibility of partnership in ending various regional conflicts and continuing nuclear arms reductions. That was an extremely promising moment in relations between our two nations. So that's how the Cold War ended. Uh, well, I cannot say that today we are in a particularly fortunate situation as regards relations between Russia and the United States. I described my experience of efforts to end the Cold War in the book that you can still order from Amazon.com. It's called My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. Even though it was published 25 years ago, it is fortunately still in print, and you can learn a lot more from my memoirs about my experience. But why are we today talking about a difficult relationship between Russia and the West, between Russia and the United States? This is because the benefits of ending the Cold War were to a significant extent ruined by subsequent events. In particular, the NATO enlargement, which was seen in Russia as very unfortunate and as a new dividing line in Europe. So this perception of NATO as a threat is still very much a fact in Russia, and that was the first step toward the unraveling of the new relationship between Russia and the West. Uh, the United States and generally the West, after the end of the Cold War, were not treating Russia as an equal. They declared victory in the Cold War, even though ending the Cold War was a common victory. Russia was not happy with that kind of declaration of victory in the Cold War. Then the actions of the United States and NATO in Yugoslavia. You may know that Belgrade in Serbia was bombed in 1999 because of the conflict in Kosovo. Another step toward the unraveling of the new relationship between the Soviet Union, between Russia and the United States. Then George W. Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty. Remember, I mentioned that treaty, the treaty on limiting the missile defense systems. That again was seen by Russia as a hostile move by the other side, by the United States. Finally, relations seemed to be on track again when President Medvedev, at that time the president of Russia, and President Obama of the United States signed the New START Treaty, the treaty that cut the numbers of nuclear weapons, of strategic nuclear weapons, also quite substantially, and limited the remaining nuclear weapons. But then again, it began to collapse. It began to collapse when the relationship between Russia and the U.S. turned sour, and the personal relationship between Obama and Putin turned sour. And then in Russia, at least, there were hopes that relations will pick up with the new president when Donald Trump was elected. This is a photo of their first and only summit in Helsinki in 2018. But then President Trump announced the US decision to withdraw from the INF treaty. So the US has by now withdrawn from two very important treaties with Russia, the ABM treaty and the INF treaty. Where do we go from here? How do we build a relationship or rebuild the relationship when the United States keeps withdrawing from treaties and destroying the foundations? Well, my recipe, my prescription for how we can end the current bad phase in US Russian relations is, first of all, dialogue. Establish dialogue. Work for success, but don't hope for miracles. It takes time and patience to achieve a result. Keep your eyes on the goal. Do not get off course when stuff happens, such as incidents, spy scandals, mutual allegations, and things like that. Keep your eyes on the goal. The current important goal is to extend the New START treaty signed by Presidents Obama and Medvedev. Keep your eye on that goal. The spy scandals and various incidents and mutual accusations are not nearly as important as the goal of saving the world from the prospect of nuclear war, as the goal of further reducing nuclear arms, as the goal of making sure that the two nations that can actually destroy each other do not do so. And then go for win-win. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It has to be a win-win game where both sides win. This worked with Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, and this can work again, and hopefully it will. Well, thank you very much. I think I'm done. It took me about 40 minutes, and we can now go to the Q&A.
This is great, Pavel. Thank you so much. I mean, I've been receiving messages in here with people, very excited with all the information you're sharing with us. Thank you for your time and doing this super exclusive webinar with us. I have some questions for you. I'll try not to pass the 10 to 15 minutes we have limited for that, because I know your time is very much valuable, and I love to see all the pictures with you and the president. It's amazing. It's really amazing. So I'll start with some questions. The first one comes from Mexico, and this question is how they're interested to know how did Cuba became a communist, and how did Cuba started to work together with the Soviet Union.
Well, in Cuba, the revolution that brought Fidel Castro to power was an anti-dictator revolution. Cuba had not been a democratic country, there was the Batista dictatorship. And initially, the revolution in Cuba was not really communist. Fidel Castro and his brother Raul were not at that time Marxist, Leninist communists. They were not. But then, uh, because of the what I think was a misjudgment by the United States, which decided that the Castro regime was unacceptable and tried to overthrow the Castro regime by means of an invasion. You may remember the words the Bay of Pigs. So a US invading force landed in the Bay of Pigs, and it mostly consisted of uh, anti Castro Cubans, whom the US helped to try and depose, overthrow Fidel Castro. That did not succeed, but that made the Castro regime an enemy of the United States, and so they were looking for allies. And the Soviet Union became Cuba's ally, and it influenced the mindset and the thinking of the Castro regime, and specifically of Fidel Castro. And so, within just a couple of years, Castro, from a revolutionary who wanted to topple the dictator Batista, uh, turned from a revolutionary into a communist. Uh, that was something that I think did not work well for any of the countries involved. It didn't work well for the United States. It didn't work well for the Soviet Union, which had to subsidize the Castro regime for decades. And it did not really work well for the Cubans because even though Cuba has significant achievements in education, in healthcare, uh, the Cubans are a proud nation, respect them. But nevertheless, I think that having the same kind of a regime and no democracy and freedoms for so many years, ultimately, I don't think that that was the best outcome for the Cuban people. So the mistakes made by both the Soviet Union and the United States, and also by the Cuban leadership, cost all of us dearly. But what we have now is a situation that we have to address. Hopefully, there will be some kind of a change in this difficult relationship between the United States and Cuba. But again, to repeat, Cuba becoming a communist country was not the initial goal, the initial objective when the Batista dictatorship was overthrown.
Great. So it was not in the plans, right?
It
It
was
was
not
not
in the
something
plan. It was
pre-planned.
not in the plans. But history is like this, quite a few things that happen do not happen as a result of some preconceived plan, but rather as a sequence of circumstances and bad decisions. To give you one example, of course, it's the First World War. The First World War in Europe, in a continent of a great civilization, great nations that had achieved so much, and then they get involved in a kind of battle that decimated a whole generation of young people in Europe. And that World War, the First World War, was not the result of a plan of aggression by any of the nations involved. So, unfortunately, these things happen in history, and it's the objective of leaders to prevent this from happening.
Absolutely. I'm drowning in questions here, which is great because people are extremely interested in everything you've been sharing with us. I'll try to select a few so we don't run past your time. The next question comes from Brazil, and the question is, in your point of view, who was the most interesting and intelligent of all these men that you worked closely with? If you had to choose one that inspired you, who would that person be and why?
Well, I would certainly choose Mikhail Gorbachev, but that's probably because I worked with him. By the way, I still work
Yeah,
with him. He is 89 years old.
really?
Yeah, he has some
Whoa.
medical issues, but nevertheless, he is still following what's happening in the world, trying to be active, writing, granting interviews, and things like that. So I cannot be very objective in my judgment, and so I do choose Mikhail Gorbachev. But let me say that I have enormous respect for the other leaders with whom I worked. I worked with Gorbachev, but I interacted with other leaders such as Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher. They played a very important role. All of them were human beings, which means
Yeah.
that, of course, they made mistakes. Of course, all of them, including Gorbachev, sometimes overreacted. All of them, including Gorbachev, sometimes did things that I would have done perhaps differently. But it all pales in comparison with what they achieved. Really, in just 4 to 5 years, they
Hmm.
ended a conflict, a confrontation, a standoff that had lasted 30 years. That was an amazing victory, and it's a victory for all of them, I think. So I respect them
It
all.
was indeed. It was indeed, absolutely. Another question that we have that is also from Brazil is, how did it feel for you being part of this? When you were into these meetings, when you were negotiating between these two superpowers of the world, how did it feel? Did you realize that you were in the middle of maybe the most important situation in the world? Can you share that with us? Was there a moment that you remember today and you look back and you say, oh man, that meeting I was super nervous because the situation was very delicate.
Oh, that happened several times, but overall, I think that yes, I understood that it's a matter of great responsibility that I was faced with enormous responsibility, enormous challenge. But very frankly, I didn't have that much time to think about my role because of the work that I was doing. And it was, above all, for me, a professional challenge. And because interpretation at meetings of that kind can be quite difficult for all kinds of reasons. So, as I said, for me, it was mostly a professional challenge that I tried to meet in the best possible way. There were moments when we were nervous, I think all of us, but I was younger, so perhaps less experienced, so perhaps I was even more nervous than the others. And let me say, as I said, all kinds of stuff happens. Today, we are looking at spy scandals. We are looking at various allegations of interference and bad things uh, that allegedly are being done. But similar allegations, similar scandals, similar incidents happened during my time, during our years, and we tried, despite the fact that it made us very nervous and sometimes emotional, we tried to focus on the objective, on the goal. And so these things, thinking about one's role, about one's contribution, or being nervous, or this kind of thing, it's really not as important as the uh, great international challenge that all of us tried to meet. And of course, as I said, I'm really very proud of what I was able to do to help those great people to end the Cold War and, in particular, the nuclear arms race.
And it is great, because then and listening to you saying that, and then we can recall to great leaders in the past that they always say that when you have a great reason to fight for, and you have a major reason to fight for, all these moments, delicate moments, you just run through them because you have something bigger, to achieve, and that's exactly what you told us. This is
Exactly,
really
exactly.
this is really
Yeah,
amazing. Yes.
yeah.
I'll go for one last question because we are about to go over our time, and this is, I think, a bit more a dense question. It goes on politics and a bit more of the situation Russia is at the moment, and the question comes from Brazil, and the question is: do you believe that the way the Cold War ended and the outcomes of it have anything to do with the foundations of Putin's government today?
Well, I think that the way we ended the Cold War has lessons for Putin, for Trump if he is reelected, or for Biden if he is elected. Of course, the personal characteristics of leaders are important, but ultimately, it's the enormity of the challenge that I think must persuade them to work to rebuild the relationship. Um, Putin wanted to cooperate with the United States in the beginning of his service as president. In the year 2000, in 2001, when the United States was attacked on 9/11, he offered help. He said that he wants to cooperate with the United States in fighting terrorism. He offered solutions which he thought were mutually acceptable on issues of nuclear weapons and missile defense. And he feels that that was not reciprocated by the United States. So I think that if the political situation, if the atmosphere improves a little bit, he will be ready to negotiate. I have no illusions specifically about Putin or about Trump. Uh, Very frankly, I never voted for President Putin, but nevertheless, I believe that he is a responsible individual who will be ready to engage if and when the United States and the President of the United States is strong enough to begin negotiating. If there is in the United States a coalition, a political coalition in favor of negotiations. This is a coalition that President Reagan was able to build. He had the support from the left and from the right. And Gorbachev obviously wanted to negotiate. That's how the Cold War ended. I think if we work to build support on both sides for negotiations, then negotiations will start and they will be productive. I do understand that this is quite a challenge, but very frankly, uh, there is just no other way. As I said, dialogue and negotiation, it worked once and it can work again.
Absolutely, yeah. Dialogue is always the best solution, right? Can I have
Definitely.
one more question? Can we have one more question, please, of your time?
Yeah, if we have time, yeah.
The last one. Okay, the last one. Um, so it goes in the same line that you were talking about Reagan, and sometimes when you look at books and history books, you see Reagan putting out the Reagan doctrine and militarizing and supporting financially countries to fight against the Soviet Union. And at the same time, you look at Gorbachev coming out with Glasnost, with Perestroika, showing a sort of more of an openness to a possible negotiation. while you look at the U.S. and then you see Reagan, supporting military, the armies and financially all these countries, especially in Central America. Based on what you just told us just now in your last answer in the presentation, can we assume that both governments put the same efforts toward the end of the Cold War?
Well, I obviously think that many of the agreements that were reached, in many of those agreements, the Soviet Union probably did more and went more than halfway to achieve those agreements. We recognized that someone has to perhaps be a little more forthcoming to do a little more than the other side to achieve the great goal. But when you talk about things that the United States did during President Reagan's time, certainly there were things that the US was doing that we did not like. But obviously, also, there were things that we were doing that the US did not like. And we tried to actually negotiate and discuss those disagreements as well. This is important. When you have disagreements, do not just engage in propaganda saying that what the other side doing is bad, that it's a crime to send weapons here and there. It may be true, but negotiate about those things as well. But also have a big goal that you can share. And that was, I think, what Reagan and Gorbachev achieved. They had a big goal of ultimately a world without nuclear weapons, of reducing the nuclear arsenals, of destroying those weapons, and it's on that ground that they were able to start building. But it was not easy because, as you say, yeah, this was still a Cold War in which both sides did certain things that the other side did not like. You cannot solve every problem all at once, but you have to focus and you have to move step by step. This is what we tried to do.
Understood. Yeah, but normally it starts with one side when you want a negotiation. So I will not ask you more questions, although I'm drowning in questions here. It's amazing to see how we all got so interested in the history and in everything that you're sharing with us. It has been truly an honor. I wanted to thank you in the name of Inca Europe, Inca Russia, in the name of all of our partners and friends across Latin America. I just wanted to. It's amazing that you have your last slide, and I wanted to share with you all that are here with us, working in the travel industry. Um, the third point that you put in there: keep your eyes on the goal and do not get off course when stuff happens. And I think it is a moment for all of us in the travel industry to keep our eyes on the goal and work together for success. Thank you once again. We are excited to be able to greet all of our partners from Latin America and Europe as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Pavel, once again. We truly appreciate your time. We are honored to have you here with us. And guys, this is actually we wanted to give you a taste of one of the most unique experiences we can offer, not only in Russia, but across Europe. So this is, we're planning to do something more, some additional webinars, but we will be in touch with you. All questions that you have lined up here for me, I'll try to answer those that we can, and maybe share some questions with Pavel in case he wants to answer them. Thank you all. Have you all a great weekend, and we'll be in touch by Monday with the recording of the webinar that we just did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and hope to see you in Moscow.
Absolutely. Bye now. Bye.